So for the last number of weeks, we've been going through a book called The Story, and if you haven't been here these last number of weeks, just to explain what the story is, it's God's Word presented in narrative form, where the authors took sections of Scripture and lined it up in a way that it just tells the story of God's grace and God's mercy as He reaches down and He saves His people. And the way that it has worked is that there's three stories within the one story, and that's the story of what God's doing, the story of the context of what man and woman, what humankind is doing, and finally the third part is how we connect to the story. And last week we had the opportunity to talk about Joseph and about how God used him to prepare Egypt for 70 years of famine by storing up the grain in the 7 years of plenty. And through this, God used Joseph to serve as a blessing to the people of Egypt. Now the grain he collected also served as a blessing to the people of Israel, of Jacob and his descendants, as they went to Egypt, first of all to buy grain, and then later on that they were able to move there to settle in that land while they waited for the famine to end. And as we've seen in that section, that God's hand in Joseph's life, even when Joseph himself was not able to recognize how God was working through him, when he was in the house of Potiphar, when he was in prison in the land of Egypt, that the Lord provided for him even there, and God used him to accomplish His plan. And so too with the Israelites, that God provides for them in that land as well. That as Jacob and his descendants move, that Pharaoh gives them the land of Goshen, which was one of the better lands within Egypt. And that the people of Israel were able to succeed and to be able to do well in that land. And over the course of time, Jacob passes away. And in the final chapters of Genesis, Joseph dies as well. Before he does, he has his final words to his brothers. He says to them, "I'm about to die, but God will surely come to your aid, and to take you up out of the land He promised, to take you up out of this land to the land He promised on oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." Now, as we flip from this, the end of Genesis, into the beginning of Exodus, we see that this promise has not moved much farther along. In Exodus 1, verse 6, Joseph and all his brothers and all of that generation has passed away. And this next generation that follows, and the one after that, remain in Egypt. But then, as we see in the very next verse, the following generations are quite fruitful, that they grow in number. They multiplied greatly, they increased in number, and they became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Now, on one hand, we can look at this as a sign of God's blessing, that the Israelite people were living out their creational mandate to be fruitful and to increase in number. And as they did, you might say that God blessed them. Already only a few generations after Jacob, the promise that God had given to Abraham, that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sands on the seashore, already seems to be coming true. In fact, at the beginning of Exodus, the writer points out that as few as 70 people moved from the promised land down into Egypt, that Jacob and his descendants totaled about 70 people. And yet when they leave the promised land by Exodus 12, Exodus 13, we see that over 600,000 men, plus women and children, had gone out from Egypt and into the wilderness. They truly were growing in number. The problem is that part of the Lord's covenant with Abraham was that God would make him into a great nation. And as long as the Israelites were living in the land of Egypt, they could not be a nation of their own, that this promise that God gives to Noah was not coming true. But what did happen with this was that the rapidly growing numbers of the Israelites is something that drew the attention of Pharaoh. This new Pharaoh that had no knowledge or no wisdom of who Joseph was, no awareness of what the Israelite people had done and how they came to that land. This Pharaoh now looked at this growing nation and he considered them to be a threat. He says that they will join with the enemy if ever we are at war, and they will fight against Egypt, and then they will leave our country. And so Pharaoh enacts a plan. He puts slave masters over them, he oppresses them, and he forces them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramses, which were store cities for the king. He continues to enslave them and causes them to build more and more for him, to build bricks of clay and straw, and to build up Pharaoh's empire. Even so, the Israelites continue to be fruitful, and they multiplied even more. So that Pharaoh and all of Egypt have to work the Israelites even harder. Still, they increase in number more and more, and so Pharaoh feels that he has to enact a new plan in order to control the Israelite population. He instructs the midwives of the Israelites to kill the baby boys as the women are in labor and as they deliver their children, but then to allow the girls to live. And even when this plan doesn't work, he extends the command beyond the midwives and to all the Egyptian people. He commands them, every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. And so this is the context that we see that Moses is born into. There's nothing really exceptional about Moses' birth. We read that he was the son of a man in the tribe of Levi, who was married to a Levite woman. His mother sees that he's a fine child, and so she tries to hide him and to save him. Now, we're not quite sure what the text means when it says that he was a fine or a handsome child, but knowing a lot of mothers, I think that most mothers would think this of all their children. And so Moses' mother desires for her child to be saved, and so she comes up with a plan to hide him away in her house. And this works well for about 3 months until he becomes too loud and is crying, he makes too much noise, and it becomes impossible for her to keep him hidden in her house. And she knows that if he's discovered that one of the Egyptians will take him out of her house and bring him to the Nile and throw him into the waters there where he'll be drowned. And so she places him in a basket covered with tar and pitch. She hopes that this basket is watertight and that it would keep him afloat until someone would discover him and would have mercy on him. Now, when I share this part of the story, it might seem like I should be standing over there talking about what God does in this story and saving Moses and acting through his parents. But the truth is that at this point in the story that the Israelite people had very little indication that God was hearing their prayers, that he was hearing their cries. And they were struggling through their slavery, through the loss of these baby boys, and through the challenges they were facing. And so Moses' parents act alone in putting him in this basket and hoping that he will somehow be saved by the waters of the Nile instead of drowned in them. And the Israelite oppression and slavery continues. And even after Moses is pulled from the water, even after he enters Pharaoh's house, or the house of Pharaoh's daughter, to act as her son, the Israelite slavery and oppression continues. And Moses grows up in that house. in the house of the daughter of Pharaoh. And as he grows up, as he comes of age, the slavery and the oppression of the Israelites continue. And once Moses has reached the adult age, possibly around 40 years old, he goes out of the palace. He witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and he kills that man, and he hides the body, and still the Israelite slavery and oppression continue. Moses flees from Pharaoh. He runs to Midian, where he helps the daughters of Jethro, a priest of Midian, and still the Israelite slavery and oppression continue. While he's there, Moses has time to marry Zipporah, the daughter of Jethro, and they have children. And in this time, still, the Israelite slavery and oppression continue. Did you notice around 80 years? Moses was 80 years old when God meets him in the burning bush. They estimate that Moses lived about 40 years in the house of Pharaoh's daughter. And then he spent another 40 years in the wilderness with Jethro and with his family as a shepherd of the sheep there. And all this time, all these 80 years plus the time before Moses' birth, the Egyptians continued to enslave and oppress the Israelite people. And yet, when we get to the end of Exodus 2, we read that the king of Egypt died. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and they cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham and with Isaac and with Jacob. And so God looked on the Israelites and he was concerned about them. Like Joseph in the house of Potiphar, and in the jail, the captain of the guard, the Israelite people were never far from God. They were never out of his reach. And if we look closely at the details, we can see God at work in each detail of these first two chapters of Exodus. The rapid population growth was indeed a sign of God carrying out his covenant blessing of building a nation within another nation. God was in the process of making him a great nation, and he was working through their oppression to allow the population to grow so rapidly. These midwives as well, the ones who refused to kill the baby boys, were God-fearing women. And they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, and so they acted according to God's will and not Pharaoh's. And the kindness of God allowed them to escape punishment at the hands of Pharaoh as well. And God acted behind the scenes in the actions of Moses' parents, in allowing them to try to hide them, first in their own house and then in this basket that was covered in pitch and tar in the Nile River. God was already orchestrating his plan to save the Israelite people. Now it's interesting, the word that's used to describe basket in this text is used in one other place in Genesis, and it's a much bigger basket that we see in Genesis. In fact, it's not a basket at all. It's the ark that God put Noah and his family and the animals on when he saved them from the waters of the flood. You see, in Genesis, God gave Noah an ark. God allowed Noah to build this ark so that he could save them, so that he could enact his redemption plan already then to save people from the waters. And now a much smaller ark. God saved not just one baby, not just Moses, but God carries out his plan. He takes steps in his plan to save the Israelite people from the land of Egypt and from slavery. This basket covered in tar and pitch was much more than just to save Noah from the Nile. It was to save the entire Israelite nation. You see, God heard the Israelites cry for help, and he enacts his plan to save them. And so he meets Moses in the form of a burning bush. From the flames of a fire within a bush, the fire burns, and yet the bush does not burn up. And the Lord uses this to draw Moses to himself, but he's also pointing ahead to what is to come. You see, in each of the plagues, God somehow upsets something within his creation order. Each of the plagues goes against the laws of creation, the laws of nature that God had put in place. And so too, this bush that is on fire, that doesn't burn up, it surpasses logic, it goes beyond God's creation order, and God is using that to point to what he is about to do. You see, God's saying that he is over the rules, the laws of creation. God is in power. He put these laws in place, but he is not bound by them. And he reveals his plan to Moses of what he's going to do to save his people. In the bush, the Lord says, I have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and a spacious land flowing with milk and honey. And God's plan includes Moses. He says to him, so go now, I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. And of course, we all know the story. Moses gets right up and he goes straight to Pharaoh and he advocates for his people, right? Well, not exactly. Moses doubts his own abilities and whether or not Pharaoh will listen to him. Moses says to God, who am I that I should trust? Or who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and to bring the Israelites out of Egypt? He questions whether the Israelite leaders will recognize his authority and respond to him by what... He questions whether the Israelite leaders will recognize his authority and respond to him and by what name they should call him. He questions, he continues to question, and he still has doubts. He says, what if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you? And then in Exodus 4, verse 10, he continues to doubt. He says, pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow in speech and in tongue. Moses gives the Lord every reason that he can think of as to say why he is not a good choice. And each time the Lord responds, he gives him a name by which he should call God. He tells him what to say to Pharaoh and to the Israelite leaders. He gives them signs to demonstrate for both Pharaoh and for the Israelite leaders. And finally, he reminds Moses that it was God who gave him his mouth, and so it would be God that would help him to use it. And still, with all of these assurances, Moses still says, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. Now I want to pause for a minute in this story, and I want to bring us into the details of this story. Moses is often portrayed in other parts of the Bible as one of the great heroes of the Bible. In the Mount of Transfiguration, it's Moses who appears alongside Elijah as Jesus is transfigured, as the disciples see Jesus' heavenly form, his heavenly body given to him for a few moments on that mountain before he is to be crucified. And in Hebrews 11, Moses is mentioned as one of the great heroes of faith. The Hebrews 11 chapter is often called in our Bibles the heroes of faith. And actually, the newest translation of the NIV calls it faith in action. And I think this is a much better description because when we look at Moses in this way, in how he resisted and how he held back, the faith that he demonstrates in these first chapters of Exodus is very much less than heroic. But I believe that this is what makes Moses' story very real for us. It's more believable because many of us share Moses' doubts. We don't think that God can, or we don't think that God will use us. We doubt our own abilities to speak. We don't think that others will listen to us, or that they will hear what we are saying. We end up asking God to send someone else. Have someone else do that, God. I can't stand in front of the church to speak. I can't teach that class. I can't witness to that neighbor who lives beside me or down the road. Send someone else, God. But when we do these things, we make the same mistake that Moses did. Moses' mistake had nothing to do with doubting his own abilities, or even how well Pharaoh or the other leaders would be able to hear him. Where Moses truly went wrong, where God finally confronts him and gets angry with him, is when he asks him to send someone else, because what Moses is doing is doubting who God is. He's doubting the character of God as God has made his covenant promise, and God has promised to give Moses the words, and God has promised to enable him to do what God is calling him to do. And that's the same with us. When we doubt, it's not our own ability that we doubt, but it's God. It's God's faithfulness. It's God's dependability. It's the very character of God that we call into question. But as we continue on in the story, we know that God didn't let Moses stay in the wilderness. In fact, God sends Aaron out to him to be his mouthpiece. And God leads him into Egypt to confront Pharaoh and to lead the Israelite leaders as they rally the people and as they bring them out of Egypt. Moses does go. And as he goes, he continues to doubt, he continues to struggle as he meets resistance both from the Israelites and from Pharaoh. And still, God uses him. Now, if you've read the chapter of the story for this week, you'll know that we still have a lot of ground to cover, that the story starts with Moses' birth, and it carries on right through all 10 plagues, and through the Israelites leaving Egypt and going out into the wilderness and crossing the Red Sea, and even where God provides food and water, and he provides for the people as they grumble in the wilderness. And that's a lot to cover, and there's so much good. I've actually considered sometime after this doing a series on each of the plagues so that we can follow how God acts through this. We don't have time to do all that this morning. But what I do want to do is to draw your attention to the 10 plagues. And to draw your attention to what God is doing within the plagues and how He's working in the lives of His people. And one of the questions that we have one of the questions I have about the 10 plagues, one of the struggles that I had before looking at this text is how God seems to be acting through Pharaoh. We read in Exodus 4, verse 21, God's words to Moses even before he goes to Pharaoh, even before he goes back to Egypt. When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh's all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But, the Lord says, I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. So when we read this, Part of us wants to say, hey, this is unfair. Pharaoh doesn't even have the chance to repent, that the Lord hardens his heart and makes it so that he can't let the people go, even if he wanted to. And this promise is a promise to punish Pharaoh for failing to respond when it seems like Pharaoh has never been given the ability to respond. In Exodus 4:22, this is what the Lord says, Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so that he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. And these words to Pharaoh from God, it seems like God is choosing his favorite. He is setting the Israelites to one side and saying, they are my firstborn and they are my favorite, and because you have gone against them, I will kill your firstborn son. We view God as a God of both justice and mercy. A God that allows us to repent of our sin, and he forgives us and he restores us to a right relationship with him. This picture of God hardening Pharaoh's heart and not allowing him to repent, or to let the Israelite people go until all 10 plagues have been unleashed, and then drowning Pharaoh and his whole army in the Red Sea doesn't seem quite fair to us. What if Pharaoh had been allowed to repent? Would it not have been a very different story if instead of hardening Pharaoh's heart, that God made it soft and he allowed him to respond to Moses' demands? Now, the first answer to this question is that Pharaoh would not have responded favorably even if God didn't harden his heart. You see, Pharaoh's heart was hard already. As Moses first approaches Pharaoh, Pharaoh responds with these words. He says, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and will not let Israel go. You see, this nation that had come to him and that had brought in Egypt blessing. If Pharaoh were to look back in the history books, I'm sure he would have known the blessing that the Israelites were, but he refuses. Instead, he sees how having the Israelites enslaved in his own land are a benefit to him and how he can profit off of them, and that if they were to go, that he would lose this. And so he refuses. He had hardened his own heart. He refuses to see the Israelites as a people of God. He refuses to show them any kind of justice or mercy. Instead, after Moses asks them to set them free, he oppresses them even more. He demands that they continue to make bricks without supplying them with the straw that they needed to do so. So he makes their job even harder. He oppresses them even more after he hears the name of the Lord. And then after each plague, we hear a similar refrain. One of 3 things is said after the plagues. Either Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh's heart was hard, or the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not listen to Aaron and to Moses. You see, Pharaoh is doing his own thing here. He's not simply at the mercy of God and God hardening his heart, but Pharaoh was looking after his own needs and his own nation. And he was giving no regard to the people that he was oppressing. You see, it was him and it was his father before him that first oppressed and enslaved the Israelite people. Rather than see them as God's people and experience the blessing through them, Pharaoh chooses to exploit them. And this exploitation included not only slave labor, but it also included the murder of innocent Israelite children. Pharaoh tries hard to work against the covenant God has put in place with his people, and for that he receives the just judgment that he deserves. Our God is a God of justice and mercy. He judges those who oppress his people. And he extends mercy to those who are oppressed. And the entire plague narrative is a show of God's power as he acts on behalf of a people who are oppressed. God called Moses out of the house of Pharaoh and out of the wilderness to stand with the people of Israel. Now, when we as Christians try to connect with the story of the Exodus, we sometimes like to put ourselves in the shoes of the Israelite people. We admit that, yes, we grumble and complain sometimes. But when we face difficult situations, we ask God to intervene on our behalf. But the truth is, if we're to look close at the story, we're a lot more like Moses than we are like the Israelite people. You see, Moses had already been set free as a baby. He was saved by his parents' actions when they placed him in the Nile River in the basket. And he was saved too by Pharaoh's daughter who claimed him as her own. And he was allowed to live as a free man in the house of Pharaoh as his people continued to be oppressed and enslaved. Brothers and sisters, if you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, you have already been set free. You are no longer trapped in sin. And unlike Pharaoh, you won't experience the consequences of your sin. And with this freedom comes the call to stand with those who are oppressed, to share the gospel and to allow God to bring about his justice in this world. Moses was called out of his freedom to stand with those who are oppressed. And we are called as a result of the freedom that we have in Christ Jesus to stand with those who continue to be oppressed in this day and in this age. Every day, as we turn on the news, as we have conversations with other people, we encounter situations of oppression and abuse, where people are held back, people are prevented from living out their call, from experiencing the grace and mercy of our Lord and Savior. And we are called to act on behalf of those people. As Jesus began his ministry, he read the text of Isaiah 61 in the synagogue. He said, "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and to release from darkness for the prisoners, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for those who grieve in Zion, to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair." When Jesus read these words in the synagogue at the beginning of his ministry, he sat down and then he said, "Today these words have been fulfilled through me." You see, Jesus came to proclaim freedom for the captives, the prisoner, and the poor, and those who are brokenhearted. And when he gives us his Spirit, this call extends to us as well. And so it's my prayer for us this morning that we will recognize the situations and the people who are oppressed, and that we will find ways to stand with them in the name of justice, in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Let us pray. Dear Father God, you have done a mighty act in saving your people, Israel, from Egypt. You've done an even mightier act when you sent your Son, Jesus, to suffer and to die and to pay the price of our sin, Lord, so that we could experience salvation. So that we could no longer be held responsible for the price of our sin, Lord, and the wages of sin, which is death. And we give thanks for that, Lord, and we know that calls us to a higher calling of responding to the gospel message and living it out in our lives. in such a way that others may know that you are Lord and Savior, that others may know that you are a God who is just, a God who shows mercy, and a God who stands with those who are lost. Lord, you call us to stand with those people, to stand for them, and to help them to stand through the power of your Holy Spirit. I pray that